Hello and welcome to Reflections on Gaming. Gaming is a passion of ours, and we want as many people as possible to understand why gaming is more than just a hobby or a children's pastime. To that end, each week we discuss a topic related to gaming. We try to delve deeper into its meaning, how to appreciate it, or just discussing what that means to us. This week, we want to take a closer look at roguelike games. What are they, and how do we enjoy them? I'm Jordan.
And I'm Weston. And before we get into the meat of this podcast, we just want to take a second to hear from our awesome sponsor this week. So, roguelikes. Roguelikes are awesome. Jordan knows, I've spent a lot of time playing roguelikes, so I was really excited when this topic kind of came up on our docket, and we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about the history of them, what defines them, what makes them fun, and then talk a little bit how they've evolved and how different games have kind of changed the formula, both well and not so well. But before we get into any of that, what are roguelikes? The name actually is derived from the game Rogue, which came out in 1980. Rogue was one of the very first randomly generated dungeon crawling games, and what made it kind of special, and what has really defined, the very, very main defining characteristic of these games beyond anything else, is that in Rogue, when you died, you were dead. It was over. The next time you started the game, you had to start from the very beginning. Having no progress you made was saved. So it was one life. As soon as you died, that was it. You had to start the game all the way over again.
That's right, and the purpose of the game was to make it through several levels of the dungeon to pick up this chalice, and there was a little bit of story to it, but the main game was essentially a role-playing game dumbed down to be very simplistic. In fact, the graphics of the game were in ASCII art, which just means it uses symbols from the keyboard to display everything. But it used that simplicity to its advantage by making the gameplay very complex, in that every time you started the game, the layout of the dungeon would be different. The items and enemies you would face would be randomized. And of course, there was rules put in place so that you wouldn't start out with the end boss in the first room, before you got anything. But for the most part, you never knew what you were going into. Now, that game came out in 1980, and it took quite a while for other games to kind of pick up on it and try that same formula for their own. But recently, there's been a bit of a renaissance in roguelike games because there's just so many of them. So many. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes these games roguelikes or roguelites. And talk about how dying and being forever dead,
the distinction between roguelike and roguelite,
because you probably wouldn't think
is important to understand.
That would be true.
In this podcast, we're mostly going to be talking about roguelites because they're much more popular, they're much more widespread, and that's because they're kind of a natural evolution, and it taps a little bit more into what a lot of gamers enjoy about games. The roguelike, where, well, the difference is roguelike with a K. Those games are very, very, they're almost completely based on rogue, and at the end of every run, everything is available to you from the very beginning. When you start your very first game of rogue or roguelike games, everything the game has to offer, you can experience in that first run. There's nothing to unlock. There's no new characters. There's no items to pick up that you can unlock during later runs. It's all just right there. And when you die, you're dead. You go back to the beginning, and literally no progress has been made. roguelites with a T are a little bit different, and they're a lot more widespread, a lot easier to find, and admittedly easier to talk about in this kind of capacity because they're much more popular. Games like The Binding of Isaac, Slay the Spire, those kinds of very high-profile roguelite games are very indicative of this formula, in that the game is still completely randomly generated. In general, they're still tough as nails, and it'll take you a really long time to kind of get really good at them because they are very, very unforgiving in general. But when you start the game, and even for many, many, many hours that you're playing this game, every time you finish a run, you're most likely unlocking something, or at least you've made progress toward unlocking something, or you have the capability to unlock something. Whether that is a new character, a new challenge, new items, a new boss fight, a new floor of the dungeon to go to, or the tower if you're ascending the tower like in Slay the Spire. Essentially, every time you play, not only are you getting better at the game like you would in roguelikes, but you're actually unlocking more options to make yourself more powerful, or to just change the game in certain ways.
It's important to note that in both roguelikes and roguelites, you need to be able to complete the game from the get-go, right? So while in roguelites, you will tend to unlock new things that can improve your survivability, it's not guaranteed. It depends on how well you understand the game and how well you utilize that item. But to make a good roguelite game, it needs to be completable right when you pick it up. Otherwise, it feels a little arbitrary to the player because they're like, okay, I just have to die so many times until the game will let me, beat it, until it'll magically give me the combination I need to get it. That's not the point of the game. The point of the game is you improve, and the faster you improve, the sooner you will complete whatever task you're aiming for. But roguelites,
that's right, they aren't
kind of tap into the potential.
As you unlock things in roguelites, they don't get easier by any means. They just
you improve.
Offer more options to you. And something that's also not necessarily not necessary to make it a roguelite, but is very, very popular. And it's unusual to see roguelites without this. Is branching paths that will lead to different types of room, different floors. They might lead to different final bosses. So a lot of the time, they, like Jordan said, they're completable from the beginning. But a lot of them have so much content and so many different paths that you can follow that it will take you most likely a long time to even discover everything the roguelite has to offer, let alone beat every single path. And so it kind of gives you it kind of gives you an incentive to keep playing it and playing it and playing it and unlock more things, even if you've beaten one or two or three of the final, in quotation marks, bosses.
Right. The last thing I want to say before we get into talking about the specific mechanics that make it interesting and how those mechanics can lead to player enjoyment, I just want to put the time investment of a roguelike in perspective. Most roguelites that I have played, you can generally finish the game, quote unquote finish. You can complete a single run of the game in about an hour. Okay, so more or less than an hour, thereabouts, is how long it's going to take you to accomplish what it is the game is telling you it wants to be. It wants you to do. That is not a very long time. Most first-person shooters, which are generally regarded as the shortest kinds of games, are 6 to 8 hours of playtime. Most RPGs range between 50 to 100 hours, with MMORPGs being, you know, thousands of hours up to infinity hours, depending on how engrossed you are in them, just how much you like to waste your time on that kind of thing. But while it can only take about an hour to finish a single run of a roguelite game, to complete the game, to unlock everything it has, to finish all the challenges it has, to unlock all the trophies, to explore all the facets of its story, to play through all its characters, anything and everything that there is to experience in the game can take thousands of hours. And not just arbitrarily like you're doing the exact same thing, except, you know, one text log is slightly different. No. You can have significantly different experiences for hundreds up to thousands of hours in these games. So there's a lot of power in the fact that you have so much randomness going into them. So with that in mind, let's start talking about these aspects of the game that lead to their longevity, lead to their distinctiveness, and hopefully what lead to their fun. I think the first thing that we should talk about is this idea of permadeath, both to explain how it's different from most games, and explaining how those
central.
differences can actually lead to a fun time.
If a game claims to be a roguelike or a roguelite and permadeath isn't a thing, it's lying to you, because that is like integral to the way that these games work. And, you know, to a lot of people, that kind of idea really turns them off. But to explain why it kind of works in this scenario, I'll kind of compare it to Minecraft, right? Minecraft has a hardcore mode that has permadeath. If you die once, it's over. You're done. Your world literally gets deleted after you die. And for some people, they really like that. But it can be very annoying. I've played on plenty of hardcore worlds myself, to pour 10, 15, 20, even, you know, some people who are very good at the game and really dedicated can put hundreds of hours into these hardcore worlds. And then suddenly, you know, an explosive creeper creeps up behind you in a cave. You weren't being as careful as you should have been. You didn't have a shield. Boom, dead. You're done. Your world gets deleted. And suddenly hundreds of hours of work gets flushed down the drain and you have to start from scratch. Now compare that to a roguelite. You're going through this run and you feel like you're doing really well. You have some pretty solid items that are working together in really good ways. But you get to a room that's just really tough. It has some of the enemies whose attack patterns you don't necessarily know super well, because you haven't gone this far in the game very many times in past runs. Or it's filled with spikes and you don't have flying, and there are things that keep blowing you into the spikes. Whatever it is, you die, it's over, you have to start over, but you only spent like half an hour to 45 minutes, right? The length of time it takes to do each run, like Jordan was saying, is so short in most roguelites that dying is really no big deal. You know, it's kind of just encouragement. Is like, wow, you learned from it, right? Oh man, like, okay, well, if I come across that room pattern again, or if I come across that enemy again, I know what to do next time to kind of try to counteract it. And you might still die to it a couple more times, but every time you feel like you're making progress in your skills, and it's not setting you back so far that it is like rage-inducing. Which I think is really why permadeath is so important, and why it works in these games. Because without permadeath, frankly, these games would be too easy. You know, if it only set you back to the beginning of the floor, if you could save at any, you know, if you could save and reload at any point, like, it would just defeat the point of having such short little runs, because you'd like never lose, you know? If you suddenly, the whole point is that it's randomly generated and that you don't know what's coming next. And so if you take that away, it really kind of ruins the essence of these games in general.
Right, and the main difference between permadeath and regular death in video games, permadeath, as explained, resets all your progress, you go back to the beginning, you're done. In most video games, when you die, you go back to a checkpoint or to a save point, and you know empirically what is coming next. You know what enemies are coming next, you know what weaknesses they have. Death just loses a little bit of your progress, whereas in roguelites, because of their random nature, you're never going to encounter the exact same scenario again, so you can't count on just foreknowledge to get through it. Your skills actually have to improve for you to be able to make it. Now, the reason that this permadeath can be fun isn't just because it's short. It's because, in part, it gives you a lot of adrenaline. When the idea of, if I fail, is, oh, I'm going to lose 10 minutes of progress, is shifted to, if I fail, I'm dead and I have to start all over again, even if that's still just 10 minutes of playtime, the stakes are much higher. You know that whatever time investment you've put in is not going to be replicated the next time. The items you encounter are going to be different. The enemies you encounter, the just activities, anything you do is going to be different. Well, it pushes you to try your hardest to survive every single encounter because you don't want to face that restart. Now, of course, that's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but one of the big reasons that roguelites are so popular is because of that tension. Especially because when you overcome the tension, when you succeed, you know and you feel accomplished because it was you that did it. It wasn't just hours of grinding down mob enemies. It wasn't some luck. It was because of your skill and your ingenuity, you managed to take the randomness and you managed to complete the activity set in front of you. And that's very appealing to a lot of people. Going back to some of our discussions on player types, it's definitely something that appeals to killers because they're overcoming something. It's definitely something that appeals to achievers because not everyone is going to be able to accomplish these things. And if there's little trophies or achievements tied to it, all the better. And it can even help out the what do they call it? The socialites, because they can show off their accomplishments and they have this kind of niche community that they can talk about these things with because of what they've accomplished. Whereas if they hadn't played this far, they wouldn't be able to enter into that community.
Yeah, I think you mentioned.
I think we put enough time into talking about permadeath.
I mean,
Let's
we've talked
talk
about it a little bit, but I want to
some
expand
other
on it a little bit.
What do you want to talk about?
And that is the randomly generated nature of these games. I'll just use Binding of Isaac Rebirth as a example because I've put over 1,000 hours into that game, very well versed in it. And so just recognize what I say may not apply exactly the same to every single game, but the general ideas will carry over to the vast majority of them. So in the Binding of Isaac, as every time you start a run, again in any roguelite, the floors or rooms or layout of like in Slay the Spire, it'll just be kind of different paths you can follow up the tower. Everything about that is going to be completely randomized. Sure. Sorry, procedurally generated is definitely
not completely randomized.
More proper term.
We'll get back to that later.
Procedurally
but it is
generated
based on randomness.
So each floor will have different room locations, sizes, and contents. The contents might be just some spikes or some boulders that you have to just not run into. There might be enemies, and the enemies in the rooms, again, will be totally random, what kind they are. Depending on what floor you're on, they'll get more difficult the further into the game you get. And the floors will get bigger. There'll be more rooms per floor the further in the game you get. But there also might be XL floors, which are 2 floors put into 1 floor, and they'll have 2 special item rooms, and they'll have a couple of special rooms. There'll be like sacrifice rooms where you can step on spikes and get, sacrifice some of your health to get a reward. There'll be shops, but sometimes there'll just be enemies in the shops. They won't actually be shops. You'll have to fight something instead. And essentially, there's so much more than that, but I think that's good enough to explain what I'm going for here. The more entities that are possible to be placed per floor, the more randomness there is, the more engaging roguelites are. And that's why roguelites, opposed to roguelikes, are so much more, I think, addictive to a wider swath of people, is because the more characters and items and floors and enemies and bosses you unlock, the more inherent randomness there is in the procedural generation of each floor. So the more combinations of rooms and the more combinations of items and the greater variety of bosses you're going to encounter on any given run, the more you play the game. And I think that is a huge, huge selling point for these games, and why they are so popular and why you can sink so much time into them.
Right, this randomness plays into the majority of the game, just like permadeath. Without the randomness, kind of the rest of the game falls apart because it's just missing a core piece of what makes it interesting. But the reason I interjected before talking about the difference between procedural generation and randomness is because humans are intrinsically bad at understanding randomness. There's a famous study that was done where people were shown two photos, one with dots equidistant from each other, and one with dots placed randomly. And they were shown both photos and said, okay, one of these depicts a rain pattern, which is completely random. Which do you think depicts rain? Well, the majority of participants thought that the pattern with equidistant dots was the random pattern. And it's just because, for whatever reason, we're really bad as human beings generally at figuring out what randomness is. But also, true randomness is generally not great for game design. A truly random game could have you start in one room and then beat the game in the next room with 0 challenges. That could happen in a truly random game. That would suck. That would be terrible. That would be a non-game. So that's not what game designers do, or at least that's not what competent game designers use. They use what is called procedural generation. Procedural generation is guided randomness. Essentially, the game developers, the game designers, set up certain criteria and they force the game to follow this criteria, but they give it some wiggle room. So they might say, the starting room can start anywhere and the ending room can end anywhere, but there has to be between 10 to 20 rooms in between the start and end. And then once that has been set up, now you can have between 0 and 5 extraneous rooms. And once that's been completed, then the player can play the game. And while that is not truly random, it lends itself to a far more enjoyable experience. It also makes sure that the player is always able to complete what they're attempting to resolve. One great example of this is the game Spelunky. In that game, you know how many floors there's going to be, but every floor you enter, you don't know what it's going to look like. To make sure that the game is enjoyable, the developer of the game set up a system where there's a certain probability of where the starting door is going to be and a certain probability of where the ending door is going to be. Once those probabilities have been calculated and placed, then there is an AI that determines a random route from the opening door to the closing door. Once that has been discovered, it puts down a path, and then for anything outside of that path, it chooses a random set of extra block placements to put there. And based on a data table, they're given a different chance of appearing. So there's a high chance of, some treasure appearing in these certain locations, whereas there's a lower chance of there being item shops and an even lower chance of there being some treasure chest or some really great thing to have, but you don't want to give the player too much of that thing, otherwise you ruin kind of the difficulty balance. So a roguelite game uses these kinds of principles to build itself every time you play the game, and that means that you're never going in completely blind. You know what kind of patterns to expect, you know what kind of enemies are going to show up in certain areas, you know what kind of items to expect to get in certain areas, but you're never entirely sure what's going to be there. And this really lends itself to the explorer kind of mentality of, I want to see everything. I want to find all there is to find. And to do that, I need to play this game lots and lots and lots of times. And as long as the core gameplay loop of the game is solid, as long as it's fun to play, people are going to be able to sink lots and lots of time into it without feeling like they're stagnating and without feeling like they're throwing their time away down a well. So that's why this procedurally generated layouts of the games and procedural generation of the items and enemies can be
I think definitely
really
super
great
important.
fun.
One last thing I wanted to bring
learn
up
as you play.
Again, this doesn't apply to every single roguelite, but the overwhelming majority, this is true. Nowadays, roguelites have multiple characters that you can play as, and that adds a new depth of just variety. There we go. That's the word. Variety to these games. Again, Binding of Isaac Rebirth, really great example. There's so many characters in that game. You have Isaac, who just is like really base, has very average stats, starts out with a couple bombs, starts out with a key, and doesn't really have anything else special about him. Or you could play as Samson, who, if he takes any damage in a room, the damage of his weapon, or his bullets, as it were, goes up every time he gets hit, and then it just resets in the next room. So you have a little bit of a perk, but he's also a little bit weaker than most of the other characters to begin with. Or you can play as Azazel, who automatically starts with wings and this like blood laser beam that's really, really short at the very beginning, which is super powerful, but you have to get really close to enemies. Or you can play as the Lost, who dies after getting hit one time. No matter what, you can't get any health. It's like hard mode for that game. And most roguelites have kind of variety like that. There's a couple really good ones that don't, like Dead Cells is a good example. You're always playing as the same dude. But the majority have a character selection, and that adds a lot to the game because their kind of initial effects a lot of the time synergize differently with the items they pick up. Like their automatic stats or automatic effects that they have will kind of interact with the items they pick up to do more, or to do more damage, to make the effect take place faster or slower. It can sometimes also be a hindrance and kind of weaken the effects of items if you're playing as specific characters. So that's another thing where you kind of learn more as you play, and you just kind of get more well-rounded because you have to learn to adapt to all these different characters' play styles if you truly want to complete the game and unlock everything that it has to offer in most roguelites.
I think it's interesting that you talk about the characters in the Binding of Isaac regarding this, because I think FTL Faster Than Light Enter the Gungeon and some other games do a really good job of the multiple characters, because the different characters don't just change slightly the way they play, it recontextualizes the entire game. A non-roguelite game that did a great job of this was Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight, you play it through the first time as the Shovel Knight, and it's great fun, lots of things to do, but it recontextualizes, the developers recontextualize the entire game by letting you play as a different character called Plague Knight. Plague Knight doesn't have any of the same abilities as Shovel Knight, but for his campaign, you played the exact same levels as Shovel Knight. And so things that used to be easy as Shovel Knight are now extremely difficult. Things that used to be extremely difficult as Shovel Knight, super easy. And roguelites have a great setup to allow you to kind of recontextualize the game if you ever feel like you're stagnating with a specific character. And I think Risk of Rain is also a good example of that, where it's not just slight stat changes that you receive, it's major overhauls to how you play the game, and it really forces you to learn everything there is to learn about a game, because if you don't understand every mechanic and how enemies react and how items synergize, you just won't be able to move forward. But I do think that the characters are another great kind of randomization that just shows how much depth there is in these games. In spite of the fact that they
said that, you're like, what about FTL and Risk of Rain? I'm like, oh man, you're right. I'm just looking at this list of ones that I thought about right before we recorded. There's just so many that I've played, I just forget them sometimes. But those are, in fact, better examples of how much versatility there is and how much it can change. Because, yeah, they totally change how the game is played from like the ground up. You have to completely change everything, and it's really interesting.
Well, what I think is even more interesting than the randomness that we've been talking about is that in spite of the randomness, there is a certain amount of concrete rules that roguelites follow to kind of counterbalance. Because while every level you enter and the enemy layout and the items you get and blah, 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 blah is always randomized and procedurally generated, the number of levels you have to go through and the manner in which they are kind of given to you are almost never randomized. For example, in The Binding of Isaac, you can see a little bar at the top that shows you how many levels to go through until you'll reach the next quote-unquote layer. And after you've played the game a number of times and after you've finished it, you know how many layers there are, and that doesn't change. And it's the same in Enter the Gungeon and in Dead Cells and in Slay the Spire. There's always some core, this is the number of things that you need to go through. This is set, and it is not random. But how you get there and what you have to go through to get there that's a good point. Is random.
So I think we've
and I think that's very
covered enough of the defining characteristics. All of these things are going to be pretty standard, and a lot of, every roguelite, obviously, there wouldn't be so many if they didn't have more to offer and if they didn't change it up a little bit. But all of these are really important, and you will not generally find ones that deviate too far from most of these core concepts. They might omit one or two, but these are all generally present. So we want to move on to talking a little bit about what makes roguelites fun. We've mentioned some things that are inherently fun in them, but there are a couple of other things that we want to talk about that are not only fun, but for some people, like me, are truly like addictive, and they're why I play roguelites. And for me, the biggest one is item synergies. Now, what that means is throughout a run in a roguelite, you'll come across many, many different items. Not all of them are great. Some of them you might even just bypass because the way that they interact together with the items you already have is really sucky. and that's called a synergy. In that case, it's a really bad synergy, but there are also really, really, really good synergies where you get two items, and whether or not, in general, or at least I can only speak really from the Binding of Isaac, these are things that developers put in these games on purpose. Like, they're not coded or the items aren't coded in a way that they automatically would work together, but the developers make it so that two items, when they are held together by a character, they'll do something totally different than either of them do on their own. An example of... Oh, sure.
Well, I think a better way of putting it would be they're two items that in of themselves would not necessarily create a special kind of reaction. For example, let's say that you have an item that increases the reach of your weapon, and you have another item that increases the speed at which your item leaves the barrel of your gun or whatever. Those two items on their own are just affecting some numbers behind the scenes that you don't see. And when you put them together, you will have an expected outcome. But either because of the lore or because the developers just wanted to be cheeky or whatever the reason may be, they decided to program an explicit special reaction, a synergy between these two items that, for this case, if you have something that increases the rate of fire and the distance, instead of just getting a slightly faster, farther shooting projectile, well, now you get a laser beam that goes instantaneously all the way across the screen in one straight shot. So these are things that programmers explicitly made but don't tell you about.
So
the only way you discover them is by playing the game, and
lots of games don't lend themselves to synergies like Jordan just explained. For example, to show two contrasting ways that this works, in The Binding of Isaac, you could get an item called Brimstone that makes you shoot a blood laser beam across the entire screen and does a ton of damage. And you might pick up technology Tech 2, which generally, if that's the only thing you had, would just shoot a laser across the screen that kind of wiggles around and is frankly not very powerful. If you get the two together, however, you'll shoot a blood laser beam across the entire screen that also has a thin laser wrapping around it the whole time and just massively increases its damage, which obviously not like, yeah, that's something the developer put in on purpose because he knew it would be fun and cool. Slay the Spire, on the other hand, it's a deck building game. It's a roguelite because you're starting from the beginning every time with the same kind of, you start with a base deck depending on the character you're playing as. But the way that the synergies work in that game is more deliberate. You as a player, as you play, you find out kind of what cards will riff well with other cards to do the maximum amount of damage or give you the maximum amount of defense or do the maximum amount of poison on the enemy. And so you can build these really overpowered decks because of the synergies that are kind of inherent within the cards themselves, and not necessarily like, combining two cards into one uber card that does something completely different or enhanced, if that makes sense.
Right, Slay the Spire being a deck building game, and I think eventually we'll have a podcast where we talk a little bit more about what that means. But a deck building game just means that there are cards in a deck that you have, and as you play the game, you will put more cards into your deck and or remove cards from the deck. Then when you're actually fighting against an enemy or doing something, you draw cards from that stockpile. And so like Weston said, in that game, there are not predetermined, oh, here, this one looks cooler now because of this synergy. Instead, in that one, you figure out what cards work together in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think they would. And it's not necessarily a special programming. It's just if you understand the rules of the game and you understand how things work, it will automatically work well in your favor. And I think that these synergies are really the core of what makes roguelites enjoyable, and not just getting them, but not getting them as well. And the reason I say that is because we've spoken a lot about the skill curve in these roguelite games, that whether you win or you fail really is determined by your skill rather than what you pick up. And that's not always entirely true. Sometimes you just have a bad run and there's nothing you can really do about it. But the fact that sometimes you will complete the game without ever achieving any of these synergies, and other times you'll blast through the game because you picked up 15 synergies, is part of the reason that it's so fun to play the game, because in either case, you feel like you beat the game because of your skill, not because of luck. Because if you didn't get the synergies, well, you just had to grit your teeth and get through it. And when you beat it, it's like, yeah, I did that. There was no luck involved. It was all me. Whereas if you have, 15 synergies that make you just this uber monster that nothing could ever kill, you still feel like it was your skill and not luck. Because you think to yourself, if I didn't know how these synergies worked, if I wasn't smart enough to pick up these items and not those items, never would have happened. And so in these games tend to be very difficult, especially in the beginning. But because of that, when you complete them, when you finish a run, you feel like you have accomplished something. And the better you get at accomplishing that, and the faster you're able to do it, the less the randomness feels like it's impacting your progress. And it's something that's very difficult, I think, to really describe. But once you kind of get that feeling, and once you understand that elation of completing a run and feeling like it was just because
every time you start a run, it's a new opportunity.
Very few games can achieve that.
And whether or not you have a really sucky run and you pull it off anyway, or you get those synergies, you're still looking forward to the next time to see what will happen. Or if you totally fail completely, and especially if you get like really good synergies and then your dumb mistake gets you killed, it just kind of like, you feel like you have to redeem yourself as like, well, I could do it without the synergies. It was just a fluke, Every run is just a new opportunity for you to kind of prove yourself, and whether that is through determination and through a really, really tough go, or if it's through just understanding the synergies and just blasting through everything that stands in your path, both are really satisfying and just fun.
Right, and like we said before, this really does do a great job of kind of hitting on several different player types. Obviously, the killers are going to have a great time with that satisfaction of completing it, achievers for the same reason, and explorers to be able to see and flesh out everything there is to see. It's very easy for those kinds of players to get really engrossed in these kinds of games. Socialites tend to not be quite as drawn, but some games have added in some social aspects to it to make it far more intriguing. One of those games is Risk of Rain 2, which has a co-op multiplayer option. And what better way to get socialites into your game than letting them play with their friends? And with that in mind, I think we want to talk about how this base formula that we've been kind of harping on has been modified to kind of the extremes, and talk about when that works and when it doesn't work. Because roguelites have been done so many times that outside of just shifting the genre slightly, in terms of the Binding of Isaac is kind of a top-down shooter, which is different from the original Rogue, which was a top-down dungeon crawler, no projectiles, to all projectiles. That's different. Slay the Spire is quite different in that it has a card-based combat system. Enter the Gungeon has tons and tons of guns. Dead Cells is melee and traps and magic and shields, and there's all these different things. But we're going to talk about some games that really deviated from this formula to try to not just set themselves apart, but
we've been talking
trying to do
relatively
something
positively
different,
about
trying
roguelites
to
and how much
evolve
fun
the
they
formula.
are. So I'm going to start off with maybe one that didn't riff off super successfully. Streets of Rogue is a good game. Don't get me wrong. And don't get us wrong that we're saying any of these games are necessarily bad. We're just talking about them in terms of, what defines roguelites and what they did and whether that did a really good job or not of adapting that formula. Now, Streets of Rogue is more of like an RPG. There's a myriad of characters to choose from. Like, I don't know the exact number, but at least like 20. And they're all pretty different, and they all have different starting equipment. But you go through, and every floor that you go through is ginormous, and there's at least 2, sometimes up to like 3 and 4 objectives that you need to accomplish on each floor until you get to go to the next floor. And you can talk with people, you can kill gangsters, you can be a cannibal and eat people. There's a lot of different options for things to do. But my problem with the game, and I feel like the unsuccessful adaptation that they went for, was that it takes a very, very long time to complete a run. If you were to do a completely successful run of Streets of Rogue and complete every objective on every floor and get to the end of the game, it could take you a solid like 3 to 4 hours to do one run. And I think they were going for a more lengthy RPG type roguelite. But unfortunately for me playing through, that just meant that after I got to a certain point and I got killed by the cops or by a gang or just got set on fire or just didn't find any food to heal myself, so I just kind of slowly died inch by inch, I had no incentive to start another run because it took me so long to even get to that point and then just die and lose everything, which I think was a pretty big misstep and too much of a deviation from kind of the short run style that I'm used to hold my attention.
Right, and I think that it's important to recognize that anytime you make a deviation in a game as a game developer, you need to consider everything that's going to impact. I'm sure that the people who developed Streets of Rogue, when they increased the length it takes, they thought, well, this way it's going to improve how you feel when you complete it, because it took you significantly longer. And they also thought that it was going to improve the quality of the game in between wins and losses, just because you have more meat to enjoy. But they didn't, and obviously this is my assumption based on that, what we've been talking about. But it seems they did not take into account the fact that when you lose hours of progress, it is very defeating. Let me put things in perspective. Sometimes you'll be playing a game that has a checkpoint system. So the most amount of time you'll ever lose is maybe 5 minutes of time. Okay, but if you keep losing on that same checkpoint over and over and over again for like an hour, okay, that 5 minutes doesn't matter. You're going to rage quit, chuck your controller across the room, and be done, right? So the length of time in between your checkpoints, your permadeaths, or whatever, is less important than how they impact your game. And so it's just the fact that Streets of Rogue, the impact is just that now you lose more really, I think that is a bigger misstep than anything that it could achieve from adding that additional time. But let's not be too down on these kind of striations, and let's talk about something that is more closely aligned with Rogue, but did something so different that it really recontextualizes the entire game, and that is Crypt of the Necrodancer. Crypt of the Necrodancer is very similar to the original Rogue in that it is a dungeon crawler. No projectiles, it's just items. There's a bunch of enemies, and you're trying to get to the bottom. The way that it switches the whole game up is that every single floor you're on has a specific song that plays, and you have to play the game to the beat of the song. Every single step you take, every single attack, every single purchase of an item, everything in the game has to be to the beat of this song. And as you go deeper and deeper into this dungeon, the songs go faster. And not only do you have to go in time to the songs, but if the songs finish before you get to the end of the level, it will throw you into a special enemy gauntlet that is in between floors. If you succeed, you go to the next level, no problem. But you likely won't, because there's tons and tons of enemies, and if you were waiting that long on the previous floor, you probably weren't doing that well to begin with. You may not be able to appreciate, with me just talking about it, the kind of stress and just how different it is to play a game in the beat to a song, but it 100% recontextualizes the game in a way that is unlike anything else you have likely played. Even if you've played, DDR, Beat Saber, Guitar Hero, any of those sweet games that are all about rhythm and timing and skill, this game makes you think in half-second intervals, and it is amazing how much fun you can have in it. And it really helps that every run in that game tends to last, up to 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think
rather than even an hour.
I've played it.
So it's really easy to
little.
Jump in, jump out, and have a real fun time with that game.
I was unable to appreciate it because of some medical stuff. Just the flashing lights and the beat was pretty off-putting for me. But the fact that all the enemies will even attack in tempo makes it so that you as a player, you're kind of memorizing how you're memorizing the attack patterns of these enemies, not only in terms of, what are they doing, but in terms of how many beats until they're doing it, which is really very interesting. And I wish I had been able to play it more. I might give it another shot sometime, but because it is a very, very interesting departure, like you said.
Yeah, it is definitely probably not great for people with any kind of photosensitivity issues, but a great way to get into it, and not to push them too much. But the creator of Crypt of the Necrodancer managed to do a kind of collaboration with Nintendo, and they created a semi-roguelite Zelda game with the same gameplay as Crypt of the Necrodancer, and that has much softer lighting effects, and probably be a great way for people to get introduced to that kind of game, Zelda in general. But anyway, back to the topic at hand, roguelites. Let's talk about another game that kind of missed the mark, and I'll start talking about this one. Dicey Dungeons, a game we both played. It's a fantastic game. It does some things very, very interesting, but it also did some things that really hurt the experience. Dicey Dungeon is a turn-based deck building game, but the deck that you build is really, really small, and the cards that you get aren't usable except by placing dice on them in a given encounter. So every turn that you have in an encounter, a certain number of die will be rolled for you. And I believe it starts at 2, and then as you level up, it increases to 4 or 5, depending on what you've got. And so every single round, there is randomness, not only in what cards you're dealt, some depending on the character, but also just what cards you can use.
So all the cards that you build,
and
you have the option of whenever you encounter a new card, you have the option of whether you want to take it or leave it. And the card, you can only hold a certain amount, and it's all very dependent on who your character is. But some cards require you to use 2 dice. Some cards require you to have to roll at least like a 4, at least one of your dice to be a 4. Some of them require it to be a specific number, or even 2 of a specific number. So you're heavily incentivized to kind of broaden out your deck as much as possible, as much as you have the option to at the different stores and chests, so that you have so that you never go a turn without being able to play something because you got, 2 numbers on your dice that you don't even have cards that are usable with that number. For me, I don't know what your biggest pet peeve with that game was, or you thought the biggest misstep was. For me, it was the lack of variety. You have the option to play as 6 different characters through 6 different chapters, which was really great. I thought, and each chapter changes something about the character's play style. That's really interesting, and I really like that. Unfortunately, the cards that you get, the enemies that you face, and the bosses that you face, the bosses that you face for each character in each chapter are set. So if you get to them in one in a chapter and lose against them, it's no longer random. You know what the boss is, you know what their moves are, and you can plan to beat them, which I think takes away a little bit of the draw of roguelites to begin with. But even more than that is that the enemies and the cards that you find throughout your playthroughs start repeating pretty fast. I think after probably playing through 3 of the characters' chapter 1s, maybe 4 of them, I had probably seen every enemy that the game had to offer, and at least 3/4 of the cards that were available to me in the whole game. Which isn't great for a roguelite. Like, if you're gonna make your roguelite have that much content narratively, that many different chapters, it's gotta hold up with that many enemies and bosses and card variations and synergies. Otherwise, players are going to get bored with seeing so much repetition.
Right, and I don't think that necessarily means that it has to be completely new item or boss or anything like that. It can be derivations, but if there's nothing, then that is a problem. My main issue with the game is that it felt too deterministic and random. In terms of, I felt like sometimes I did the best I could possibly do, and I still failed. Like, I picked the best cards I could pick, I did the best moves I could do with the dice I had, and I still lost. Which, perhaps I just really suck at the game, and I'm just wrong. But after playing it, a bunch of times and succeeding a bunch of times and having other times where I just get my butt handed to me, I really do feel like it's more of kind of a randomness thing, especially since I've played many games, roguelites in particular, where when I died, it was my fault. I knew it was my fault. I didn't feel like it's because I was just unlucky. But Dicey Dungeons just often feels like there's nothing you can do. And adding that on top of the fact that there's really not tons of content in the game really made it feel like certain characters in particular just were slated to.
No, definitely. I definitely see what you mean. Games like Enter the Gungeon, Binding of Isaac, even Dead Cells, Slay the Spire, which is a deck building game. None of those rely on the luck of the draw, right? Slay the Spire, yeah, it's random in the order that you're drawing your cards, but you know that whatever cards you get, you can play, and you can plan accordingly. And Dicey Dungeons, it was, a very interesting concept, but like you said, when not only the cards you get are random, but your ability to even use them during the encounter is also random, you can get screwed over with absolutely no fault, absolutely no fault of your own.
Yeah, so just a couple more things we want to kind of touch on before the end. One game that did a great job, and let's talk about both of these at the same time. Moonlighter and Rogue Legacy are both games that have permanent improvements to your character over time. And while they technically have a permadeath system, it's not implemented quite the same way as most roguelites. In Moonlighter, your character doesn't actually die. They just have to leave the dungeon for the night, and you have to deal with the day cycle, which is a shop management sim. We don't want to go too in-depth there, but the overall improvements that you get over time is closely tied to your skill rather than randomness. So if you're good enough, you could still complete the game, and it just feels like the fact that you're getting these improved items is just you skillfully improving your character. Rogue Legacy, every time you die, your character dies, and you have to pick an heir. And you generally have 2 or 3 different people you can pick. But it has a permanent upgrade system where the money you had from the last run can be used to increase your character's attack, health, magic, all these different stats. And the fact is that unless you're willing to put in a lot of time and really get good at the game, the likelihood of you being able to complete the game with your base character is almost 0. Some people complete the game in the initial kind of semi-tutorial part because it's much easier. There's much less that you have to go through. But once you get past that part, which most people will die there on their first playthrough and then start playing the game, it is much less determined. Your success is much less determined on skill as it is just how good your character is. And that really defeats a lot of the purpose of a roguelite. Now, I personally enjoyed it. The game, I loved the fact that I could constantly improve my character, but it does take away a bit from your success at the end when it's like, yeah, I beat it, but is it because I'm good? Or is it just because I, died so many times in here that I just got my character overpowered? And the feeling is much different from a synergy or lack thereof in a traditional roguelite, because whether you get a synergy or not is partially based on luck, but it's also partially based on how knowledgeable you are about the game. Whereas in this game, there's no knowledge threshold. Everything is laid out bare for you. The speed at which you unlock things will be based on how much money you make in each run, but you'll eventually unlock everything, and that's not based on skill. That's just a factor of you will get better things for your character every time. So because of that, Rogue Legacy definitely has some major missteps. And it's hard to go back to it after completing it, because it's like, well, if I start a new game then I'm going to have to go through hours of grinding. You know, my skill isn't going to carry me through the game like it would a traditional roguelite. But at the same time, if I wanted to go back to it, I wouldn't want to start the game that I with a character and all these improvements I beat the game with, because then it'd be too easy. So it definitely has a lot of issues in terms of that. It does a lot of things really well and has some really interesting concepts, especially in terms of some diseases that your children can be born with. But just based on the kind of tenets of roguelite games,
well, I think we've covered quite a bit at this point.
A couple of missteps that really hurt.
You know, at some point we might come back and talk a little bit more about some of these games in particular, or some of these ideas in particular. But we'd love to hear what you all think, all you listeners, whether you agree with something we've said, disagree with something we've said, or just feel that we've omitted something important about the roguelite genre and the games within it. Please let us know. You can write us an email at reflectionsongaming@gmail.com, and we'd love to get, you know, we may get back to you. We might bring up your points on the show. We'll see what happens. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and even a review if you feel so inclined. It really helps us get this podcast out to a bigger audience and invite more people to reflect on gaming with us.
Discussions become a lot more interesting when there's more voices to be heard, and that's what we want this to be. We want it to be a big discussion and reflections on what gaming means to us and what gaming means to you. So we hope that you'll join us, and until next time, we hope you guys have a great week.